Hey all, welcome to the Unit 4 video. In this video, we're going to primarily concentrate on Jack Halberstrom's essay on the trans look. This video should be a little bit shorter than the other ones because I'm primarily just going to concentrate on that essay. I'll give you a couple of notes for consideration on Padman's self-representation, and there will be a note at the end about the topic proposal. Specifically, it will give you some advice on where not to go in terms of the direction or considerations, and that should help you as you move towards working on your topic proposal, which is due at the end of this unit. Remember, this unit's a little bit longer than the others because we have spring break in the middle. You are not required to submit anything over spring break, the week of spring break, those 5 days. But if you want to submit work early, if you want to submit your topic proposal early, you absolutely can. All right, so first, a little bit about terminology for this unit. Rachel Padman is going to use the term transsexual to describe her gender, and generally this is viewed as an outdated term. The term transgender is the term that tends to be used today. That doesn't mean there aren't people that don't identify as or are not transsexual. Some people still use that term, and that's absolutely fine. So if someone told you that they were transsexual, you wouldn't correct them, but the term that we tend to use in contemporary frameworks is transgender, and transsexual can be seen as a slur and can be a term that is oftentimes not utilized or is prohibited in what we sometimes term safe spaces. So when you're writing, if you write about Padman, unless you're directly quoting her, use the term transgender. And when we're referring to any of the other materials in the unit, use the term transgender instead of transsexual. So use this contemporary language. Language changes, and especially when we're thinking about marginalized groups having the right to define themselves instead of being defined through dominant institutions and through dominant groups, dominant institutions like medicine and psychiatry, for example, when we're thinking about gender and sexual orientation. It's really important to utilize terms that are used by people who are, in this case, trans or non-binary. All right, with Padman's essay, before I turn to the Halberstrom essay, which again will be the focus of this video, with Padman's essay, there are two things I want you to pay close attention to. The first is the way in which Padman's identities intersect. So Padman is a trans woman, so her trans identity intersects with her femininity. And this produces a specific social location for her, which has specific implications in terms of her power, as well as the kind of sexism that she faces. She'll give you multiple examples of the kinds of sexism that she faces, and the sexism that she faces intersects with cis-sexism, or transphobia. So cissexism is a form of sexism that is based in the assumption of cisgender normativity, and transphobia is a term that we use to connote hatred of, fear of, disenfranchisement of trans people through prejudice that is interpersonal or institutional. So institutional barriers and interpersonal barriers to fulfillment of self, recognition of identity, social freedom, political freedom, freedom to move in space, etc. So think about the way in which her identities intersect, not just her trans identity and her femininity that produce her circumstances as a trans woman, but also think about the fact that she's white. The fact that she's educated, the fact that she is relatively well off. She has access to medical care, she works in the university, and this specifically functions to also frame her social and political and economic freedom, which has an impact on her ability to express power, to affect change, to access resources, etc. The second thing I want you to note with Padman's essay with her self-representation is the fact that she was revealed to be a trans woman by another famous feminist, Germaine Greer. So Greer outed Padman, and this functions as a form of violence that can occur in the lives of trans peoples. So I mention this, and I mention this violence for a couple reasons. The first is that it is a form of violence. It can create a context in which the trans person who is revealed by another to be trans can be subject to violence, again, that is interpersonal or institutional. And also, it takes away the power of the person who happens to be trans to identify themselves as trans. So if one wants to or does not want to, that is not the cisgender person who, in this case, is Germaine Greer. It is not her right or decision or is not her right to make this decision for Rachel Padman. And in taking that power away from Padman, she's enacting a form of violence against her, a form of violence that reduces Padman, that doesn't allow her to be whole in her identity, and that makes a spectacle of her identity. So this is also not just a form of behavior that is confined to the past. Even contemporary feminists, some contemporary feminists, not all contemporary feminists, some contemporary feminists are transphobic, and they explicitly attempt to draw the lines of feminism as applying only to cisgender women. And this is really problematic. Transphobia, cissexism have no space. They shouldn't exist within contemporary feminism. But that doesn't mean that there aren't sects or segments of feminism in the contemporary era that have perfectly eliminated transphobia and cissexism. So it's something to be aware of if you're thinking about the contemporary legacy of acts like those that Greer committed, or behaviors that Greer engaged in that are cissexist and transphobic. And this action functions to reinforce some really problematic sexist ideas. So in the name of feminism, in order to protect cisgender women, Greer is actually engaging in a form of expression of patriarchal power. It is patriarchy that tells us that there are only two sex genders, and that sex and gender should perfectly align within this binary system of sex and gender. So feminists should be challenging that idea. They should be challenging the idea that gender and sex are perfectly aligned, or that sex assigned at birth produces gender identity. Feminists should be fighting against that, subverting it, challenging it. And what Greer and other feminists like her do is they oftentimes reinforce that. They reinforce the idea that femininity derives from being assigned female at birth, which is not true. All right, but on to the central focus of this video, which is Jack Halberstrom's essay. We're reading Halberstrom's essay for many reasons, but the simple reason is Halberstrom does a really great job of showing the discrepancies between trans representation that is produced by cisgender peoples and that objectifies trans people, as is the case in The Crying Game, and is the case to some degree in Boys Don't Cry. And then Halberstrom shows the way in which when trans people have the power of representation, as is the case in By Hook or By Crook, the representations of trans people are much better. They are much more complex. They cast aside the kinds of problematic framings and definitions and tropes that are oftentimes engaged in when cis people represent trans people. And this cuts many ways. So this could be in terms of when cis people are writing trans characters in films or in television programs. This can occur when cisgender peoples are playing trans people in films or television shows. So Dallas Buyers Club is an example of a film in which a cisgender person, Jared Leto, played within the narrative of the Dallas Buyers Club, a trans woman, and much of his performance was very much tied to stereotype or stereotyping. So oftentimes you'll also see cisgender people recognized for their work as trans people. So this idea that this transformation takes place for the cis actor to become this trans person in the narrative landscape of the film or the television program, and they're rewarded for that when trans people generally can't find work. So trans people's lives are mined for aesthetic production in various genres, but trans actors have difficulty finding work. Laverne Cox does a really great job explaining this if you're interested in learning more about this as well. All right, so what Halberstrom ends up arguing by the end of the essay is that it is possible for there to exist a subversive trans look within a film, within the landscape of the film. So what we've been thinking about throughout this course is, can oppressed peoples sustain a gaze that is powerful through art? And can there be a feminist gaze in and through art? And so Mulvey's essay introduced us to this notion. The dominant gaze is male, the dominant gaze is white, the dominant gaze is also cis, so that's what we're looking at with this unit. The dominant gaze is cisgender and it's heterosexual. So the economy of the landscape of film, of art, of literature, of the world, of our shared social and political world, is confined by norms of cisgender and heterosexual identities. And so Halberstrom shows that this doesn't necessarily have to be the case, that it is possible for there to be a sustained trans look. And we're going to look at what that means. And the way that we're going to do that is, first we're going to look at two failures, and then we're going to look at a successful version of the establishing and maintaining of the trans look in a film. I would urge you to maybe watch one of these films if you have some free time over spring break. You could watch all three and you would get a great indication of what Halberstrom is talking about through viewing these films. By no means do you have to view these films. It is not required of this course, but if you found Halberstrom's essay interesting, if you want to gain a deeper understanding of Halberstrom's argument, I would absolutely recommend watching these three films. Boys Don't Cry has been pretty widely viewed by audiences, both in the United States and across the world. By hook or by crook, is a part of new wave queer cinema or new wave queer film. And The Crying Game is also a more popular film, but not as popular as Boys Don't Cry. All right, so the first film, The Crying Game, has a trans character, Dill, who is fetishized throughout the film, whose trans identity is made a spectacle of, and whose trans identity is used as a plot twist in the film. The director even went so far as to require that the media who viewed the film prior to a wide release not reveal the secret of the film. And the secret of the film is Dill's trans identity. And that's really problematic. So It reinforces the idea that trans people have to be discovered, that they're hiding something. If you have to discover something, if something has to be revealed, then the logical implication is that something's being hidden from you, that you're being deceived. So the trans woman in the film is deceiving the audience and the persons whom she is located in cinematic space with, through her not being revealed earlier as trans, or through her not being open about her trans identity. And this, again, is really problematic. It's problematic in terms of the utilization of trans identity within film, but it's also problematic politically. It reinforces some transphobic ideas about trans identity, namely that trans women aren't really women, that they are really men pretending to be women, and that they shouldn't exist in women's spaces, etc. So both in terms of the lack of power that Dill has in the film as a trans character, but also in terms of the social and political implications of what that implies, or what that suggests about trans identity. It's really problematic. It's really dangerous. So again, it reinforces the trope that trans people are deceptive, that they're not to be trusted, that they're dishonest about their true selves, and that they aren't really men or women. In this case, a woman. It's a trans woman it's a transgender woman in The Crying Game, who is one of the main characters, Dill, who is discovered to be trans by Fergus, another one of the main characters. And we see that Dill's trans identity, Dill never really holds the gaze. Again, she's fetishized. She doesn't have the power of definition within the film, and her identity is used to reinforce the notion of the white colonialist as savior. So the movie's never really about her. It's not centered on her. It doesn't enable her identity in terms of personhood, not in terms of trans identity, in terms of personhood. When you think of yourself as a person, you don't just think about your gender identity. Dill's identity in the film landscape is pretty much confined to her gender identity. She's reduced to her gender identity. And again, that's really problematic. The second film that Halberstram covers in the essay is a little bit better in terms of trans representation. Boys Don't Cry is based on a true story. Brandon Teena was a real person who lived in the United States and was murdered. And this film covers his life and his death. So again, the second film does a little bit better of a job of representing a trans person on screen in terms of ensuring that we recognize Brandon's gender. So the audience is invited to take Brandon's gender identity seriously, because the characters in the film take Brandon's gender identity seriously. Brandon is always presented as masculine, and so the audience, through the presentation in the film landscape, both in terms of the camera lens, if you recall from Mulvey's essay, as well as the way in which especially Lana, his girlfriend, looks at him, gazes upon him, frames him, the audience is invited and in fact required to recognize him as a man. So that's good. That is a difference between The Crying Game and this film, Boys Don't Cry. We take Brandon's gender identity seriously. Brandon's gender identity isn't just a plot twist, and this is a step forward in terms of trans representation. So he's always presented as properly gendered, and again, one of the central techniques through which this occurs, or one of the central ways in which this occurs, is through the utilization of Lana, his girlfriend, and the way that she looks at him and affirms his gender identity throughout the landscape of the film. There is also intersectional analysis present within the film as well, specifically the intersection of gender and class, not just for Brandon, but also for Lana. But it's not perfect in that the director of the film and the writer of the screenplay erases the murder of a Black disabled man that occurred at the same time as Brandon was murdered. So you have the erasure of a person of color in the landscape of the film, even though this Black man was murdered alongside Brandon in the house that he too was murdered in real life. All right, so that's one problem if we're thinking about intersectionality. The director has been questioned about this, and she, said that she had a limited amount of space to tell the story of Brandon, or to tell Brandon's life, and she opted to leave out some details in order to be able to concentrate on Brandon Tina's life and death. However, in addition to this, there are some other problems. Specifically, there's a scene towards the end of the film, and Halberstrom unpacks this for you as well, that reverses this initial through most of the film. Brandon is presented as whole in his gender identity. We recognize him as a man. Lana recognizes him as a man. The camera recognizes him as a man. But after he's sexually assaulted, he has sex with his girlfriend Lana, and he is portrayed as having lesbian sex with his girlfriend Lana. So he's misgendered in this scene. He is imagined to finally reveal his authentic self and to engage in sex with his girlfriend as a woman. And this is really problematic. It isn't necessarily verified to have happened in real life, and the idea that after you've been sexually assaulted that you'd want to have sex with your girlfriend or your boyfriend is perhaps a problematic suggestion to make in a film to begin with, but more than that, the fact that he is misgendered after he's already undergone the violence or experienced the violence of sexual assault is another form of violence. To misgender someone is to enact a violence against them that is symbolic, that is linguistic, and that can result in physical violence as well. So this reinforces some of the problematic symbolic components of the crying game. It again reinforces the idea that trans people's true selves are their sex assigned at birth, not their gender. And so in terms of being a step forward, it's a bit of a step forward, especially the first majority part of the film, but then this scene's really problematic. All right, finally, the last film that Halberstrom analyzes and that actually produces and sustains a trans look is By Hook or By Crook, and this is achieved in a couple of different ways. First, the trans characters are created and represented by trans people, and the two main protagonists, Shai and Val, are trans in the film, and they double one another. So one of the lecture slides will go over four of the ways in which trans people tend to be represented, or trans identity is represented in film, in contemporary film. The fourth approach, the idea of doubling or queer world making, tends to be the most successful because it enables the establishment of a world that is not dominated by a cis gaze. So the crying game is fully enmeshed, or the world in the crying game is cisgender, is defined by cis normativity. Boys Don't Cry does a little bit better of a job of creating the possibility for establishing the validity of trans identity, but again fails by the end of the film. By Hook or By Crook is a fully queer world, and the way in which this world is established is through primarily the friendship that is established by Shai and Val, Shai and Valentine. So they double one another. They look at each other and confirm one another through the gazes they possess. Other important components of this include the fact that they never explain their gender identities to the audience. So their gender identities aren't a spectacle. They don't have to be explained. So this establishes the possibility of a trans look, of trans normativity within the landscape of this film. So by not explaining their gender identity, by not explaining their gender, to the audience, it creates a context in which the world created in the film remains effectively queer, and it functions as a rejection of a cis-hetero gaze that would attempt to straighten up the relationships and the structure of the world in the film itself. The queer effect is also produced through the way in which the characters relate to one another. So they aren't bound by or through the conventions of the straight world. Even how the friendship is established between Shy and Valentine, it begins with the theft of a wallet. And usually you wouldn't trust a person who steals your wallet, but this act and the act of returning it functions to establish a deep friendship and a deep connection between Shy and Valentine that pervades the film. And so it's a consideration of the way in which many of the conventions and the production of family and the production of relationships and meaning and work, etc., are very much contained within the limits of or the constraints of gender and sexuality. And by hook or by crook creates a context for a different form of world to be produced. So by the end of the essay, Halberstrom will refer to this as the production of the figure of the queer outlaw. And in the lecture slides, note the difference between the traditional outlaw that tends to be masculine and masculinist and the queer outlaw, and think about that difference. That difference will also help you think about the production of meaning and value within By Hook or By Crook as well. All right, so that's all for this video in terms of lecture notes or in terms of unpacking some of the course material. Before I end the video, though, I want to give you some advice on your topic proposal. So what's required of your topic proposal is in the course space. So you should look at the description of the topic proposal in Unit 4. But I want to give you a bit of advice in terms of whom you should be looking for or investigating or thinking about proposing as the sort of source or the center of your research paper. So you want to be looking for a feminist artist. The feminist artist can be a cisgender woman, a transgender woman, a non-binary person, a genderqueer person, a transgender man, etc. And you should be looking for someone who produces self-representation that is very much in line with the course materials. So who is not appropriate to choose? So celebrities tend not to be good people to center your papers on. Celebrities tend to not work. Many students in the past have attempted to propose and or write papers where the person whose self-representation they focus on is a celebrity, and their papers tend not to be as strong as people who look for feminist artists. So feminist artists in terms of visual art, feminist artists in terms of film, feminist artists in terms of literature or autobiographical works through the written word, poets, spoken word artists or poets, musicians, etc. But you want to look outside of the purview of or the framework of popular culture because oftentimes celebrity self-representations within popular culture tend to not push back on dominant systems of meaning because they exist within dominant systems of meaning. They benefit to some degree from those dominant systems. They can be co-opting feminist values in order to sell their brand or to sell their product to a larger audience, especially if feminism is is becoming more recognizable within a contemporary framework. So celebrities tend not to work. So I would advise you not to propose celebrities as the persons that you seek to center your final research and analysis paper on, but rather instead look for feminist artists in line with, or that line up with, the course material that we've been covering this far. So again, celebrities, even when they engage in activism, they tend to be reform-oriented in the kind of activism or strategies that they opt for or that they push for, rather than revolutionary and radical, which are the forms of feminist activity and self-representations that we've been more properly covering in this course. All right, so have a good spring break, and make sure that you are working on the course material for Unit 4. All right, have a good day.